5th year since it was rescued by the government in 2008. In 2012, the bank made a pre-tax loss of £5.2 billion. The RBS announcement comes as European Union officials unveil new rules to cap bank bonuses. Under the agreement, the cap would be 1 year's salary, and there have been warnings this would hamper economic growth in the UK. Well, the RBS chief executive, Stephen Hester, told the Today programme on Radio 4 he was already reducing staff pay.
I was clear when arriving at RBS 4 years ago that there was the need to change the way that our people were paid and to align it more closely with what we wanted them to do, part of which is profits, but part of which is serving customers and making sure risk is right, and so on. And so we have both reduced pay to reflect performance and fundamentally changed the way in which it is aligned. Now, obviously, whether there should be formulas around pays, whether cap or anything else, other people can argue about, but my job, I think, as a businessman, is to try and align pay with the things we want our people to do for our customers and for shareholders and society as a whole.
How soon are we going to be able to sell off RBS? Because the taxpayer owns 82% of it at the moment. How soon before we can sell it off?
That's a very important question, and I think one of the encouraging aspects of recent debate has been that clearly privatisation is coming further onto the agenda of the government, at least in their thoughts, and I welcome that. From the point of view of RBS, we know that the government doesn't want to own our shares, and we are doing everything we can to facilitate a sale. I think that the clean-up of RBS is entering its last phases, and I'm hopeful that as we go past 2013 and into 2014, the company will look much more like a normal company. Of course, I would like it to go from a normal company to being a really good company, and we're trying to do that too. But I do think that privatisation is now a light coming down the tunnel, much closer to us and within reach in not too distant a period. It's for the government to decide. It's their shares. They will decide the timing, the manner, the price, but we're doing our best to deliver a company that other investors want to buy the government's shares from them.
Well, that was RBS's chief executive. We'll get the thoughts from Norman Smith in a moment or two, but Treasury ministers have been giving the government's response. Let's hear.
Well, our strategy has always been for a stronger and safer RBS, one that we can eventually return back to full ownership in the private sector. And the Chancellor has made it clear that he wants to see an RBS that is focused on British business, so lending to British business and British consumers, and not with an overwhelming investment bank, and an investment bank that actually helps the lending to British business but doesn't actually end up rivaling it. So that's important, and I think what we've heard today from RBS is a step in that direction, and it's very welcome.
The choppy year ahead doesn't fill one with confidence, though.
It's a choppy period in the financial markets, full stop, and clearly RBS will be impacted by that. But they're making the right decisions by downsizing the size of their investment bank, by looking at options for citizens and other international activities that they have. They're gradually getting more and more focused on UK lending to UK businesses and UK consumers, and that's what we want to see.
You talked about getting it out of public ownership, and how soon?
Well, eventually we will do that, but it's difficult to say when, because RBS, although it's making the right choices and it's dealing with all its big legacy problems it's had, partly because it was a badly run bank in the past, partly because regulation in the UK was so poor in the past, but it's dealing with those issues, and eventually when it's in a safer and stronger position, we will bring it back to the private sector, but we'll do that in a way that makes sure that we get the best deal for taxpayers, and so that means getting the right timing and getting the right price.
Well, that was Sajid Javid. Let's get some more on this from our chief political correspondent, Norman Smith, who joins us from Westminster. Thanks very much indeed. £5.2 billion loss doesn't sound too good, but we're hearing both the chief executive and the Treasury Minister making some positive noises about this, saying that the bank's taking steps towards being returned to private ownership.
Yeah, Carol, my sense is the bonus story is a bad story, if you like, for the government, and they just want to push that away. Sajid Javid saying in that interview that RBS is not run by the government, it's got to be competitive. In other words, not our problem, bank's problem. So they want to kind of put to one side the bonus story What they want to sort of get attention on is the fact that RBS, they believe, is being turned round and is getting increasingly in a position where it can be put back into the private sector. Now, when you talk timetables with them, and we heard from Savi Javid there, they back away and won't give you a specific timetable. But Stephen Hester, the boss of RBS, has given us a timetable. He said this morning that he expects RBS to be ready to be sold off within the next 2 years, i.e. before the next election. And we know within government, ministers are poring over plans over how they can get the bank back off public hands. And one idea they are looking at is this idea of a share giveaway to sort of emulate what Mrs. Thatcher did in the 1980s with the big utility companies, which proved hugely electorally popular. And from the government's point of view, if you're having to go into an election, the economy is still down in the dumps, living standards are still being squeezed, one way of giving people an electoral pick-me-up would be suddenly to give them free shares in RBS. Now, that is not confirmed. It is an option, and I'm in no doubt that if possible, ministers would like to be able to get shot of RBS before the election.
OK, Norman, for now, thanks very much.
Well, let's stay with that and also the rest of the business news, and Rebecca is back.
Thank you, Matthew. Not surprisingly, we are talking about the RBS story and those losses of £5.2 billion for last year. It's the fifth annual loss since RBS was rescued by the government in 2008. But when you strip out costs such as the LIBOR fine and compensation for the mis-selling of payment protection insurance, underlying group operating profits are up by 90% to £3.5 billion. As a result, as we heard, RBS's chief executive, Stephen Hester, said he was hoping to sell the bank, which is 81% owned by the taxpayer, within 2 years, hopefully. Well, let's get more from the banking analyst, Chris Skinner. Hello to you, Chris. It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because if you look at the headline figures, the picture looks pretty terrible, but the underlying picture is much better.
Yeah, it sounds awful, but you have to bear in mind that when Stephen Hester took over this bank in 2008, it was a dead bank, and he's had to resuscitate it, keep it alive, and try and make it into something that's a viable business that we can now sell back into private sector eventually. And he's getting there. It's taken a long time, but if you look at the numbers, it's an incredibly shrinking bank. When he took over, it had £1.6 trillion worth of assets. It's now shrunk to about 900 billion. And they're selling off key areas like their WorldPay Business Direct line, the insurance company, maybe their American bank. So it's a massive restructuring, one of the biggest in the world.
And at the same time, it's also, like all other banks, having to keep back a lot of money in case things go wrong.
Yes, I mean, they're revaluing their debts and exposures all the time, and that's been part of the hit on their numbers this year. So when we look at the loss numbers, those are actually numbers on paper. If you look at the underlying profits, as you say, they're actually doing very well. They've almost doubled the profits in the last year, and it's getting back to being a healthy business. It's just taking a very long time to get there.
So Stephen Hester was saying he hopes that within 2 years that they may be able to re-privatise the bank. It was mentioned it could mean a kind of Tell Sid campaign, you know, the RBS shares could be on sale to the public. But whatever happens, do you think we as taxpayers who own 81% of the bank could get our money back?
Eventually, yes. I mean, it's always been the plan for the government, in my view, that they will privatise some of RBS before the next election, because it will be a good news story for the next election, help them get back into office, I expect. And eventually, the banking sector worldwide will come back to being stable, bearing in mind that this is one of the biggest crises we've seen in over a century. So eventually, RBS shares will be worth more than the government paid. The question is, when will that happen? Probably in 2 or 3 years.
OK, thank you very much, Chris Skinner, who's a banking analyst. Now, more bad news for Spain with